It is late autumn 1907. After a long and difficult state visit to the United Kingdom, the German Emperor Wilhelm II decided to relax for a couple of weeks in the lovely English countryside. At this point in time, relations between the German Empire and the United Kingdom were at an all-time low. By emphasizing his close ties to the British royal family and by stressing his admiration for Britain, a country in which he had spent a considerable amount of his childhood and whose language he spoke like a native, he hoped to improve Germany's international standing. Unfortunately, his endeavours proved to be largely fruitless. While spending his well-deserved holiday at Highcliffe Castle in Dorset as a private guest of Colonel Edward Montague Stuart-Wortley, Wilhelm entered private talks with his host and hoped to convince at least him that neither he nor Germany were any threat to the British Empire. Around 1 year later, Stuart-Wortley was invited to witness a troop maneuver in the Lotharingian city of Metz. Afterwards, he and Wilhelm met once again. This time, the Kaiser asked his friend to publish the arguments he had made during his stay at Highcliffe Castle in a renowned British newspaper. And indeed, on the 28th of October 1908, an article titled "The German Emperor and England. Personal Interview, Frank Statement of World Policy, Proofs of Friendship" was published in the Daily Telegraph. While this so-called interview was initially meant to be a partially naive and a partially perfidious attempt by the Kaiser to soften the tensions between Britain and Germany, it achieved the exact opposite. Instead, the so-called Daily Telegraph crisis would later enter history as one of Germany's greatest political scandals, one which damaged Wilhelm's reputation beyond repair. But just how could it get to that point? Let's quickly take a look at Germany's diplomatic situation in the years leading up to the Daily Telegraph crisis. Towards the end of the 19th century, the newly formed German Empire began to increasingly meddle in overseas affairs and would eventually acquire a rather sizable colonial empire in Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Unsurprisingly, this was bound to provoke tensions with the leading world power at the time, Britain. One corner of the earth where the two countries had opposing interests was South Africa. There, the British were in control of the Cape Colony, which bordered the independent Boer republics, also known as Transvaal. The Boers were a group of descendants from European settlers in South Africa who viewed their British neighbours with distrust, for good reason. When the news of giant gold reserves in the Boer Republic spread in the 1890s, the Cape Colony's Prime Minister Cecil Rhodes began to demand their annexation. However, Germany had a strong interest in the Boers' independence and considered them to be in their sphere of influence. In 1895, a disastrously failed raid on Transvaal by Dr. Leander Starr Jameson caused an international crisis. London denied any direct involvement in the affair, but the governments of the other European empires had their doubts about that. As such, Kaiser Wilhelm sent a telegram to Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal Republic, in which he congratulated him on his victory. Even if the telegram wasn't much more than a simple gesture, it caused a wave of outrage in the British press. In the end, Germany had to pull back from South Africa, simply because it didn't have the means of enforcing its interests. When the Second Boer War broke out in 1899, which would result in the British annexation of Transvaal, Germany stayed neutral. Another cause for conflict between Britain and Germany was the navy. In the late 1890s, Germany began a giant fleet-building program designed to challenge Britannia's rule of the waves. This was a utopian and fruitless endeavour. Between 1898 and 1903, Germany built 3 warships. In the same time span, Britain built 15. Still, the British press continued to spread the fear of a potential German naval war until the outbreak of World War I. Furthermore, Britain and France put aside their colonial disputes in North Africa in 1904, as a result of which relations between the two nations improved significantly. Additionally, Britain and Russia ended their quarrels in Asia after Russia's humiliating defeat against Japan. The Anglo-Russian Entente was in no way the result of anti-German sentiments or a deliberate attempt to diplomatically isolate Germany. Instead, Russia was simply seen as the bigger threat to Britain's foreign interests, so it made much more sense to placate them instead of Germany. By 1908, Germany had become increasingly isolated and found itself in a diplomatically precarious situation. It is this context that we have to keep in mind if we want to understand why the Daily Telegraph article proved to be so explosive. In the article, Kaiser Wilhelm II made a few statements that one might call unwise. For one, he called the English mad as March hares for doubting that he was a friend of England and for questioning Germany's desire for peace with Britain. Later on, he said, "The prevailing sentiment among large sections of the middle and lower classes of my own people is not friendly to England. I am, therefore, so to speak, in a minority in my own land, but it is a minority of the best elements, as it is in England with respect to Germany. That is another reason why I resent your refusal to accept my pledged word that I am the friend of England." With that, he unintentionally stated that the majority of Germans were in some way hostile to Britain. Not only was that a very bold statement, but it also further reinforced the fear of an increasingly powerful Germany filled with Anglophobic citizens. A bit further on, he claimed that he personally had provided Queen Victoria with a detailed battle plan after a series of British defeats against the Boers in 1899, which would later turn the tide. And, as a matter of curious coincidence, let me add that the plan which I formulated ran very much on the same lines as that which was actually adopted by Lord Roberts and carried by him into successful operation. Was that, I repeat, an act of one who wished England ill? Not only was this complete nonsense, but it also insinuated that the British forces desperately needed strategic advice from Kaiser Wilhelm. Finally, Wilhelm argued that the German naval program was not actually directed against Britain, but against Japan and China. For that reason only, Germany must have a powerful fleet. It may even be that England herself will be glad that Germany has a fleet when they speak together on the same side in the great debates of the future. Keep in mind that Japan was Britain's ally at the time, and it seemed pretty obvious that it was a futile attempt to drive a wedge between the two of them. In Germany, the interview caused a deep political crisis. The Dutch diplomat in Berlin wrote, "The press of all parties has never attacked the person of the monarch so vehemently." Hildegard von Spitzenberg, the owner of a political salon in Berlin, wrote, "The Kaiser is ruining our political position and making us the laughingstock of the world." The outrage wasn't just restricted to a small circle of the societal elite, however. In German newspapers of all political ideologies, the statements that the Kaiser made were absolutely torn apart. The Social Democratic Party organ, the Vorwärts, condemned the atrocious incompetence that accompanied Wilhelm's foreign policy strategy. He wanted to present himself as a friend of England only a few years after congratulating the Boer leader on his victory. The nationalist press, on the other hand, was appalled by Wilhelm's claim that he had devised a grand plan for the British to crush the Boers in their war. The Rheinisch-Westfälische Zeitung wrote, "The soul of the German nation will be deeply wounded by the knowledge that its Kaiser worked up a war plan with which to annihilate the valiant Boers, a people of a kindred race." Was the Emperor also a party to the plan by which 30,000 Boer farms were destroyed and plundered and the women and children placed in deadly concentration camps? The liberal satirical newspaper, Simplicissimus, published a cartoon on its front page, making a mockery of the Kaiser's bold claim. It depicts a meeting between the ghosts of Queen Victoria and Paul Kruger. In it, Queen Victoria says, "Kruger, I can now tell you that the plan was his." Kruger responds by saying, "Then we know why you botched it so badly." Wilhelm's statement that most Germans were Anglophobes also caused some uproar. The Social Democratic newspaper stated that the Kaiser was misinformed because German workers held a lively proletarian solidarity with their British comrades. The liberal politician Theodor Barth wrote an article in the Manchester Guardian saying that he had not the slightest doubt that an enormous majority of our people would vote for England if a public poll about which country Germans like best took place. These are some great examples that demonstrate just how mass media was just starting to influence German public opinion at that time. Because of the increase in literacy in Germany, the advancement of technology and the growing interest in political affairs, newspapers had become a mass medium in the late 19th century. Historians estimate that in 1906 around 25 million newspapers were sold daily in a country with around 60 million inhabitants, most of whom were miners. The ascent of the newspaper promoted a new potential for political mobilization, but it also created an atmosphere in which political scandals could thrive. In the early years of his rule, the Kaiser attempted to use the newspapers to his advantage and put himself in the public spotlight as often as he could. He loved speaking in front of big groups of people and liked to show off his perfect mustache and his straight posture. Wilhelm was well known for his strong voice, his largely improvised speeches, and his imaginative metaphors. After a speech in front of the Brandenburg Provincial Council in the late 1890s, Wilhelm's best friend Philipp zu Eulenburg told him, "Your Majesty's great eloquence and manner exert a captivating influence on the audience and those present, as the attitude among the Brandenburgers after Your Majesty's speech has once again demonstrated." Of course, his speeches were printed in the German newspapers, which only helped to spread their popularity. Wilhelm's role as a public speaker took a massive hit in 1900, however. During his infamous Hun speech, the Kaiser encouraged the embarking German soldiers, who were about to leave for China, to show no mercy in the crushing of the Boxer Rebellion. He had gone too far this time, and he was criticized for it in the press. In the end, the leaders of the ruling party in the Reichstag and the Chancellor urged Wilhelm to show more restraint when it came to public speaking. His reputation never really recovered afterwards, and his public appearances were getting increasingly rare. In 1908, the Kaiser once again found himself under fire from the press, and the words were getting increasingly harsh. Over the course of the Daily Telegraph crisis, Kaiser Wilhelm only made matters worse for himself by staunchly ignoring everything that was going on and by pretending like everything was normal. Instead of publicly addressing the issue, he decided to go on a 2-week hunting trip to Austria and Donaueschingen. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Reichstag also didn't hold back on the criticism. At a 2-day session on the 10th and the 11th of November 1908, one politician after another denounced the perceived self-rule of the Kaiser. The national liberal politician Ernst Bassermann demanded safe guarantees against the intervention of the Kaiser in politics. No more personal moods and impulses, no more temperamental rallies, no more policies of excessive friendliness and slaps in the face. Otto Wiemer from the Free-Minded People's Party said, "What moves the German people today, what stirs their deepest souls, is the clear realization that this personal regiment exists to such an extent and is exercised in such a way that it is neither in harmony with the monarchical nor with the interests of the state. Least of all are impulsive expressions of monarchical subjectivism, surges of emotion and suddenness appropriate in the fields of foreign policy." The Kaiser was frequently accused of actively damaging Germany's international reputation with his half-hearted attempt to win over the British public in the least thoughtful way possible. He and his spontaneous, often irrational nature were increasingly seen as the main reason for Germany's isolated position in 1908. One politician who also spoke on that day was none other than the Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow, who had been in power since 1900. And all he wanted to do was to remove all responsibility from himself, no matter the cost. As it turns out, the main culprit behind the Daily Telegraph crisis wasn't actually Kaiser Wilhelm, but rather Chancellor Bülow himself. To better understand his role, we have to turn back time a few weeks. On the 28th of September, General Edward Montagu Stuart-Wortley sent his finished manuscript of the article that was to be published to Kaiser Wilhelm, who had been on a hunting trip in East Prussia at the time. In turn, Wilhelm forwarded the text to Chancellor Bülow for review, who was on a holiday on the North Sea island of Norderney. Apparently Bülow saw nothing wrong with the text or didn't want to spend his precious time on Norderney with proofreading the interview, and he swiftly approved it and forwarded it to the Foreign Ministry. There, small changes were made, but ultimately the text got approved. The media storm following the interview caught Bülow by surprise. He swiftly invented a lie and simply claimed that he had never read the interview and that it was all the Foreign Ministry's fault. Had he known of the article in advance, he would never have published it, he claimed. Whether he had actually read it or not is impossible to say in retrospect. It would be strange, however, if the bloody Chancellor simply ignored such an important document. So it could simply have been a case of sloppiness, but it probably wasn't. There is reason to assume that he knew of the contents. After sending it to the Foreign Office for inspection, a junior diplomat called Reinhold Klemet inspected the interview and sent it back to Bülow in Norderney for a final look. We know that Bülow would later dictate the proposed changes to a German diplomat, so he must surely have known something. And Bülow also knew of the significance of the Kaiser's speeches. Only weeks prior, he had sent a letter to the Kaiser's close associate, Rudolf von Valentini, in which he stressed the importance of making sure that Wilhelm exclusively stuck to a pre-written speech while touring Alsace-Lorraine. So, in light of all this was either a case of severe negligence or a malevolent and devious scheme to undermine the reputation of the Kaiser, probably a mix of both. When the Daily Telegraph crisis started and when the press began to demand Bülow's resignation, the Chancellor slowly turned the blame away from him towards the Kaiser. Among the German ministers and the nobility, Bülow still enjoyed a good reputation, and the Conservative and the Liberal parties of the Reichstag still trusted him. At the Reichstag session on the 10th and the 11th of November, most criticisms were directed against the Kaiser and not against the Chancellor. Bülow himself only gave a half-hearted defense of the Kaiser and stayed silent when the parliamentarians tore him apart. He said that the events of the past days would lead His Majesty the Kaiser to continue to show restraint in private conversations, which is equally indispensable in the interests of a unified policy and for the authority of the crown. Ultimately, Bülow emerged triumphantly from the Reichstag session. He had increased his power base in the public eye and isolated the Kaiser. Understandably, Wilhelm was furious and immediately ordered Bülow to Donau-Eschingen, where he had been staying. Valentini wrote that during the meeting the Kaiser had tears of anger and disappointment for the Chancellor's passivity when the Reichstag politicians lashed out against His Highness. Bülow could have defended him, but he didn't. Wilhelm felt betrayed, and rightfully so. For the time being, Wilhelm didn't fire his Chancellor, but the trust between the two had been irrevocably destroyed. Later, the Kaiser publicly declared that he would be more reserved in the future and would no longer interfere in foreign matters of the German Empire. In July 1909, Bülow resigned after he had lost the support of the Liberals and the Conservatives, and when his proposed tax reform was denied by the Reichstag. So, ultimately, the Daily Telegraph commotion wasn't even worth it. To see just how much of a mockery the Kaiser became in the German public, we can look at an article written by Maximilian Harden, one of the most famous journalists of his time. Wilhelm II, who came to the Hohenzollern throne 40 years after the revolution and was not a monarch in the empire, never did anything useful for the nation and yet demanded the highest honor for his will. Now he is reaping the harvest. If it is possible for him, after all that has happened, he will keep the crown on his fine head. But never again must the fate of the German Empire, of German humanity, hang on his fine will. You can't really help but feel sorry for Wilhelm. For 2 weeks, the Kaiser suffered from a psychic and nervous depression, and his self-esteem took a serious hit. He would never return back to his old self. Gone were the days of passionate speeches and confident public appearings. He mostly kept a low profile until the start of the First World War. And the whole crisis wasn't even his fault, truth be told. Granted, what he said in the Daily Telegraph article was utterly unreflected and borderline moronic. Furthermore, his refusal to publicly address the scandal and his decision to simply embark on a nice hunting trip also only made things worse for himself. But ultimately, he did everything else right. He had stuck to the constitutional rules, had sent the manuscript to Bülow for inspection, and made doubly sure that everything was good to go. Wilhelm also fell victim to a common tendency at the time that the Kaiser often received the blame for complex issues in the German government. In this case, he was seen as the main reason for the bad relations between Britain and Germany and the main culprit behind the country's isolation. Of course, this is nonsense, but he was an easy target. Finally, I want to quickly discuss how the Daily Telegraph article was seen in Britain. In the Foreign Office, the way Germany was seen often depended on the Kaiser's public personality. Wilhelm was perceived as erratic, eccentric, unreflective, and prone to sudden decision-making. In general, there was no outrage when the Daily Telegraph article was published, but rather pity and annoyance. The Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, for instance, just said, "I am very tired of the Emperor. He is like a great battleship with steam up and screws going, but no rudder, and you cannot tell what he will run into or what catastrophe he will cause." This attitude was further reinforced when news of a second, unpublished interview the Kaiser had granted to an American journalist called William Bayard Hale in summer 1908 became known. In it, Wilhelm erupted into one of his famous rants in which he went on about how Britain and the British were waging a war against God, and in which he showed his contempt for the country for 2 hours. As was typical with Wilhelm, his words are not meant to be taken personally. He oftentimes couldn't control himself and struggled deeply with making up his mind on any given subject. So his statement in the Daily Telegraph, where he claimed to be a friend of England, seemed hypocritical and hard to believe. When looking at the mess that the crisis caused in Germany, the British Foreign Office saw this as further proof for Germany's instability and unreliability. Ultimately, it's fair to say that Wilhelm's interview in Highcliffe Castle didn't significantly worsen the relations between Germany and Britain. Its explosiveness was mostly restricted to Germany itself, and the other European powers didn't take it very personally. Still, it was seen as a further sign of Germany's unreliability, and it certainly didn't do much to improve Germany's diplomatic standing. Anyway, that's all for today. As always, a big Dankeschön for watching, and I hope you liked the video and learned something useful. If you did, a like and a subscribe would be much appreciated. I would like to give a huge and heartfelt shout out to my kind supporters over on Ko-Fi. A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philipp Marchewka, Marius Gerling, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh, and Nico. You are absolutely phenomenal. Have a very nice day and see you next time.